It wasn't the funeral that haunted Emerson most. It was what came after. When the final guest left and the last casserole dish was wrapped in foil, Emerson stayed behind in his childhood home alone with the dust and the silence. His mother had gone to rest. The air still carried the scent of cologne his father used to wear. Old Spice and something older, heavier, like time itself. Emerson wandered the house with no real intention until he found himself in the basement. The basement hadn't changed in decades. Same creaky wooden shelves, same cracked cement floor. His father Thomas had always been meticulous about storage. Labeled boxes, army, straight rows of tools, nails sorted by size in glass jars. Emerson wasn't looking for anything, and yet somehow he found it. Behind a loose plywood panel, shoved behind a stack of unopened paint cans, sat a box that didn't belong. No label, no dust. Just an unassuming cardboard cube taped in a way that said not forgotten, just hidden. Emerson hesitated. Then he peeled back the lid. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Old frayed Polaroids, their edges curled like secrets. His father was in nearly every single one, but not like Emerson remembered him. Here Thomas was smiling, open, holding someone's hand. The man beside him appeared over and over, leaning against a motorcycle, kissing Thomas's cheek, floating in a lake with his arms around him. Each photo was signed in neat cursive on the back, Gale. Emerson couldn't breathe. The man who had once told him, "It's not right, Emerson. Men aren't meant to love men," had once been in love with one. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't subtle. It was affection, captured and kept for decades hidden in the dark. Emerson stared at the box as if it had teeth. He remembered the night he came out at 18, how his father sat in silence then left the room without a word. For days afterward, Thomas barely looked at him. Later, he gave him a book about getting better. Emerson had thrown it in the trash. They never spoke about it again. Now the truth sat in his lap, pixelated and undeniable. His father had loved a man before the marriage, before Emerson. Before everything that made him the man Emerson had tried so hard to forgive. What do you do with the truth when it comes too late? That night, Emerson couldn't sleep. He kept returning to the box like a wound he couldn't stop touching. He took one photo, just one, and slipped it into his pocket. Thomas and Gale on a Ferris wheel, fingers intertwined. The rest he left untouched, but the questions, they came fast and sharp. Who was Gale? Why did it end? And why did a man who knew the cost of silence choose to hand it down to his son like an heirloom? Heart Stories is where we tell stories not just about who we are, but about who we were never allowed to be. Emerson's journey is just beginning. Stay with us. What he'll uncover next might change how you see your own story. Emerson didn't talk to his mother about the box. Not yet. He wasn't sure what she knew or didn't, and part of him was afraid to find out. Afraid that she had always known and stayed afraid that she hadn't, and that this secret was somehow his. Now passed on like a burden, like a scar that no one else could see. Instead, he turned to the only other name he remembered hearing in his father's stories. The only person still alive who might know the version of Thomas that lived before fatherhood and Sunday barbecues and long silences. Martin Hayes. Martin had been Thomas's college roommate back in the 70s. Emerson remembered him from a few holidays in his early childhood. A tall man with a voice like gravel and the kind of laugh that filled a room before he even entered. They lost contact over the years, but Emerson found his address in an old leather address book his mother kept near the phone. The house was modest, tucked behind an old pine tree in Eugene. When Emerson knocked, Martin answered slowly, cane in one hand, eyebrows furrowed with suspicion that melted the second he saw Thomas's eyes on Emerson's face. He invited him in with a nod. No questions. They sat in the living room, no TV, just the soft ticking of a grandfather clock and the sound of a man settling back into memories. He never thought he'd be asked to revisit. Emerson didn't waste time. He pulled out the photograph, the one from the Ferris wheel, and placed it on the coffee table between them. Martin went still. It took him a long moment before he spoke. So you found them. Not what is this or where did you get that, just an acknowledgement, like a door creaking open after decades of wait. Emerson nodded. Who was he? Martin didn't look at him. He looked at the photo, eyes softening. Gale was everything to your father, at least for a while. We were all so young then, and the world was a different place. He let out a breath. They met sophomore year at a campus rally of all places. Gale was loud political. Your dad, he was the opposite. Quiet, careful. But when he looked at Gale, he lit up. I'd never seen Thomas like that. He paused. I thought they'd make it. I really did. Emerson listened in silence, every word slicing through the image of the man he thought he knew. Martin's voice dropped, but then the raid happened. You probably never heard about it. Most people didn't. It was some local bar in Salem, a place for men like your father and Gale to be themselves. Cops stormed it one night, claimed it was for liquor violations, but really it was to make an example. Gale was one of the ones arrested. Thomas, he wasn't there that night, but he saw what it cost. Martin reached for the photo, brushed a finger over it. After that, Thomas changed. Said it wasn't worth it. Said love wasn't worth losing your job, your family, your life. Emerson felt a pressure in his chest. So he left him. Martin looked up then, and there was pain behind his eyes. He disappeared, didn't even say goodbye. I got a wedding invite a year later to your mother, and I knew. He'd chosen a life he thought he could survive, even if it meant killing a part of himself. Emerson clenched his jaw. The room felt too small, the air too thick. But why? Why did he try to make me kill that part of myself too? Martin didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper, because he thought he was protecting you. That's what fear does. It doesn't die. It just changes shape. He saw you and he didn't want you to suffer like Gale did, like he almost did. So instead of standing beside you, he tried to pull you back into the dark with him. Silence stretched between them. Martin finally said, "You deserve better from him," but so did he, Emerson. He just never believed it. Later that evening, as Emerson stepped out into the fading Oregon sun, he felt something break open inside him. Not anger, not yet forgiveness either. Just space for the truth, space for grief, space for a man he would never fully understand, but who once had a chance at love and walked away from it. The next part of his father's story wouldn't come from Martin. It would come from the one who had been left behind, and Emerson wasn't done asking questions. The old house creaked more than usual that night, or maybe Emerson was just more aware of everything, of the things left unsaid, of the silence his father had once chosen now echoing through every room. He couldn't sleep. Instead, he wandered from the kitchen to the front porch, to the stairs that still groaned beneath his step, the same way they did when he was a teenager, sneaking in past curfew. The house was full of muscle memory, but none of it made sense anymore. Around 3 in the morning, he found himself back in the basement, not to put the box back, but to open it again. More slowly this time, as if the past might change if he turned the pages gently enough. He pulled out photo after photo. Thomas and Gale laughing on a beach, sharing a milkshake at a diner, arms wrapped around each other under Christmas lights. There was tenderness in every image, in ease, a warmth that Emerson had never known from his father's eyes. Beneath the photos was a small bundle of receipts and movie stubs tied with faded twine, and tucked under those, something thinner, a sheet of lined paper folded in half. He unfolded it carefully. The ink had faded with time, but the handwriting was unmistakable. His father's Emerson. There's something I should have said a long time ago. I don't know how to begin. You were always brave in ways I wasn't. Maybe that's why it was so hard for me to see you, to really see you as you are. Because every time I did, I saw what I couldn't be, what I left behind. The letter ended there. The page had been torn in half, jaggedly, violently, as if halfway through his father had either changed his mind or couldn't bear the weight of finishing. Emerson sat frozen, the letter trembling in his hand. He didn't cry, not yet. The shock hadn't thawed enough for tears, but there was a heaviness settling in his bones, a question that pressed against his ribs, like it had teeth. What would the rest have said? He stared at his name written in that careful, uneven script his father had started to explain. To reach out, and yet even in death, he had remained half closed, half hidden. Emerson didn't know which was worse, the silence he had grown up with, or the truth that had almost surfaced, but didn't. The next morning, Emerson sat at the kitchen table, the letter in front of him next to a cup of black coffee. He didn't drink. His mother sat across from him, hair tied up still in her robe. They hadn't spoken much since the funeral. He slid the letter toward her. Did you know? She didn't touch it, just looked at it, looked at him. I knew there were things he never said, but not this, not exactly. She didn't ask what the letter meant, didn't ask who Gale was. Emerson wondered if she didn't want to know, or if part of her always had. "I think he wanted to tell you," she finally said, "but he was afraid you wouldn't forgive him." "For being like me?" Emerson asked, his voice flat, her eyes filled with something close to pain. "For not letting you be like you. That broke something." Emerson stood and left the table. He needed air. Movement, anything to shake the dust of that basement from his lungs. But as he passed the hall, his eyes landed on the coat closet. He opened it. On the top shelf, between a box of winter scarves and a pair of cracked photo albums, was an old shoebox labeled Taxes 1985. Inside, beneath some old utility bills and unrelated clutter, another photograph. Not a Polaroid, a printed 4x6 Gale, this time alone. Older, taken from a distance, a bench in a park. He wasn't smiling. On the back in his father's handwriting again. Salem 2001. Didn't say anything. Just watched. Emerson's stomach sank. His father had seen him years after everything and never said a word. That was the moment he decided he had to find him. Gale, the man who had once loved his father, the man who had been left. Maybe to find the rest of the story. Maybe just to say the goodbye his father never gave. But more than that, Emerson needed to ask the one person who might know. Who was Thomas before he gave up? The address was scribbled on the back of an old envelope, buried in the shoebox, faded ink, barely legible. But it was something APO box number in a quiet town near the Oregon coast. Emerson booked the drive without telling anyone. The morning fog clung to the trees as the road narrowed into winding turns. The silence of the woods reminded him of his father, all still impenetrable. But Emerson wasn't here to bury the past. He was here to name it. He arrived in a town that looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. One grocery store, a gas station, a post office. The woman behind the counter at the post office recognized the name Gale immediately. "Lives out by the lighthouse," she said, her voice quiet but kind. "Doesn't talk to many folks, keeps to himself." It took Emerson nearly half an hour to find the house, a weather-beaten cottage perched on a bluff facing the Pacific. He stood there longer than he should have, hand hovering over the gate, heart pounding in places he didn't know could hurt. Then the door opened. The man who stepped out was older, of course. Wrinkles where once there had been smooth skin, white in place of black hair. But it was him. Emerson didn't need a photograph to confirm it. His posture carried the same quiet dignity, like someone who had survived more than he had spoken of. Gale looked at him, puzzled at first. Then recognition slowly set in, not of Emerson, but of the eyes, Thomas's eyes. "You're his son," he said, not as a question, but a truth he had waited years to face. Emerson nodded. "He passed a few weeks ago." Gale's mouth twitched like a muscle, remembering how to grieve. "I figured," he said softly. "He used to come here, you know. Never knocked, just stood by the fence." They sat on the porch, not as strangers, but as two people connected by a ghost. Gale spoke first. "Thomas was the love of my life and the greatest heartbreak I've ever known." He didn't say it with bitterness. "Just wait, he told me once." Gale continued, eyes fixed on the sea, "that he'd rather lose me than lose the world he'd built to survive. Said if he didn't bury who he was, the world would bury him instead." He turned to Emerson. "I didn't argue, I didn't beg him to stay. I just let go." Emerson listened. No interruptions. "I watched him become someone else," Gale said. "Saw the wedding photo in the paper. Saw your birth announcement, and then nothing. Until one day, 20 years later, he showed up at that park. Didn't say a word, just looked at me. Like maybe he'd remembered who he was. Like he wanted to apologize, but didn't know how." Emerson pulled out the torn letter and handed it to Gale. Gale read it, lips pressed tightly together, shoulders rising and falling like waves. When he finished, he closed his eyes. He tried, he whispered. Even if it was too late, Emerson didn't expect forgiveness. Not for his father, not for himself. But hearing those words, something inside him eased. "I'm putting together a photography show," he said after a long silence. "It's about men who never got to be who they were, about those who hid and those who dared not to." He paused. "Would you let me photograph you?" Gale hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the cottage was filled with books, dried flowers, and dust-covered canvases of long-forgotten oil paintings. Emerson set up his camera by the window. Natural light spilled across Gale's face like a memory when he looked into the lens. Emerson didn't see a man broken by the past. He saw someone who had survived it. Click. A single frame that was all he needed. The exhibition took place in Portland 2 months later. A gallery room filled with quiet portraits. Older men, younger boys, queer elders with stories written in the lines of their skin. But at the center, Gale, the photograph Emerson titled, "He Waited by the Fence." On the night of the opening, a small crowd gathered, murmurs, soft and reverent. Emerson didn't speak until the end. "This collection isn't about mourning," he said. "It's about seeing. My father didn't get to be seen, but he left behind fragments. Photos, letters, a memory buried so deep it took death to unearth it. He loved a man named Gale. He walked away from him, but in the end he tried to tell the truth. He just didn't finish the sentence." Emerson's voice caught, then steadied, so I finished it for him. The exhibition drew quiet tears and long silences. Viewers lingered in front of Gale's portrait longer than any other drawn, not by the aesthetic, but by the ache. Emerson watched them from a corner of the room, camera slung across his shoulder, palms sweaty with something heavier than nerves. He had told the story his father never could, not with anger, not with pity, but with truth, and still something felt unfinished. That feeling sharpened the day he returned home and found a small padded envelope in the mailbox. No return address, just his name, handwritten in a familiar scrawl, slightly slanted, pressed too hard. Inside was a cassette tape and a note in his mother's handwriting. "Found this in your father's old nightstand drawer. Thought you should hear it." Emerson didn't have a cassette player. No one did anymore. He had to borrow one from a local thrift store, the kind of bulky silver rectangle that whirred when you hit play. He sat on the floor of his studio, surrounded by prints and negatives, and pressed the worn button. The tape clicked to life, static. Then his father's voice. "If you're hearing this, I guess I never had the guts to give it to you myself, and I'm sorry for that. God, I'm sorry for a lot of things." The voice cracked, not from age, but from weight. Emerson pressed a hand to his chest. "I grew up being taught that to be a man meant being silent, controlled. That love was something you earned by fitting in. I tried to believe that I married your mother because she was kind and I did love her in the only way I was allowed to. But there was always a piece of me I buried so deep, I forgot it had a name. Then you came along and you were fire. You were honest, you didn't hide. I saw you come out and I panicked. I punished you for something I never had the courage to be. You didn't deserve that. You didn't deserve my silence or my shame. You deserved a father who clapped the loudest at your art shows, who told you he was proud, who never let you go to sleep wondering if he saw you. I did see you, Emerson. I saw you more clearly than I ever saw myself." A long pause, a shaky inhale. "You're braver than I ever was. But I want you to know, I tried to write it down, to say the words. Even if I couldn't finish, I began. I began because you deserve to know I loved someone. Once I lost him, and I lived the rest of my life wondering what it would have meant to stay. If I could give you anything, it would be the permission I never gave myself to love, to speak, to stay. Don't be like me, son. Don't let the world steal your name." Click. The tape ended. Emerson sat there for a long time, no tears, just breath. The kind you don't realize you've been holding for years. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't erasure. But it was a voice, finally, not in anger or in denial, but in fullness. The next morning, Emerson returned to the gallery. He brought a small speaker and placed it beneath Gale's portrait. Next to it, a plaque that read, "This is what he never said. This is what I'll never stop saying." And when visitors approached, they heard Thomas's voice. His real voice. The voice of a man who had once stood by a fence and chosen silence, but left behind a son who wouldn't. Weeks later, Gale returned to the gallery. He stood beside Emerson as the tape played. Neither spoke. Then Gale reached out, gripped Emerson's shoulder and whispered, "He would have been proud. Not the kind of proud people say for comfort, but the kind you carry in your blood." That night, Emerson printed a final photo, one he hadn't planned to share. It was of his father, not as a stern man in a collared shirt, but as a young boy on a swing, wind in his hair, joy unfiltered. Emerson had found it tucked between tax documents and mortgage forms. It didn't belong there, but maybe it did. He titled it "Before They Told Him Who He Couldn't Be." And beneath it, a quote etched in metal: "You can't rewrite the past, but you can stop it from writing you." This was never just a story about a father and a son. It was about silence and what breaks it, shame and what outlives it, and love too often buried, but never beyond reaching. Thank you for watching. Heart Stories, if this moved you, share it. Say the words your parents couldn't, or hear the ones your children are still waiting for. We don't get to choose the stories we inherit, but we do choose the ones we tell next.